Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for those kind words, Cara. Thank you all very much for coming this evening. What I'm going to try and do is draw perhaps slightly spurious analogy between the processes of educational assessment and quantum mechanics this evening. And as Cara said, I'm going to illustrate it with a few examples from research projects that I've been involved in. I think it almost goes without saying that assessment is fundamental to the process of learning. But actually, the role that you assign to assessment within that process depends fundamentally on your view or your theory of learning. So, for example, if you're a behaviourist and you see learning as essentially a set of connections between stimuli, teaching, and response in the form of observable behaviour, perhaps a written answer to a question, with the mind being treated as a black box, then the role of assessment is to grade the quality of the response. This is assessment of learning, and through that you might also be able to gain insight into the quality of the stimulus, the quality of the teaching. However, if you adopt a more Piagetian view of learning, whereby the learner constructs their own understanding of the world through interactions with it, then perhaps the role of assessment in that view of learning is to gain access to the learner's representations of that world. You're very much dealing with a theory of mind here. How is the learner making sense of their experiences? And the purpose for that assessment might be in order to provide them with more appropriate learning experiences. If you take a social constructivist view of learning, whereby meaning and knowledge is co-constructed between learners, or perhaps between a learner and a teacher, then the role of assessment becomes gaining access through dialogue to that co-construction. Finding out, if you're the teacher, where the student's current area of development is, that they can, the things that they know and can do unaided, and the gap between that and what they could do if they were scaffolded by the intervention of a more knowledgeable other. And Vygotsky calls this the zone of proximal development. So it's discerning the zone of proximal development and how I can help the learner to scaffold across it. And the principal way in which I do that is by providing feedback to the learner. So this is assessment for learning. And we know how powerful feedback and assessment for learning can be. John Hattie, my compatriot, in his famous meta-analysis of many hundreds of research studies, found that the most powerful intervention that any teacher could provide to advance learning was feedback as a result of assessment for learning. And he's found an effect size, an overall effect size of 1.13. Now what that means in statistical terms, say we've got student learning lying along a normal distribution like this, the bell curve, then what an effect size of 1.13 means that if you provide effective feedback to that group of students, you can effectively shift them all by over a single standard deviation, which is roughly equivalent to an entire national curriculum level. So if you don't give them effective feedback, they're at this level of attainment. If you give them effective feedback, you can actually shift their attainment, the entire cohort, on. But significantly, the effect of feedback is much diminished as soon as you put a numerical mark at the bottom of the script. As soon as you put a number on it, the students look at the number, they don't look at the feedback, and this effect is minimized. And of course, assessment plays a much wider political role in society than just the individual interaction between the teacher and the learner and the feedback that's involved in assessment for learning. And in particular, a lot of public assessment is what we might call high stakes. The outcomes of it matter. Now, that's always been the case for GCSEs and A-levels. They're high stakes assessments for the learners. However, increasingly, they're also high stakes assessments for the teachers, because in England, their salaries may depend on the outcomes of that assessment. They're also high stakes for schools, and that schools' position in league tables, or in Wales, their categorisation is dependent on those high stakes assessments. And in a globalised assessment world, assessment has implications for entire education systems. So we have international comparisons that are made on the basis of PISA, TIMSS, PEARLS. And we look up to the countries and the education systems that appear to be effective: Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Finland. And countries such as Wales, where the results haven't been as high as we'd want, live in fear and trepidation of the next set of PISA results, which incidentally are coming out on the 7th of December. So these are high stakes assessments for our global competitiveness. And whilst I don't have a problem with that, I think that assessment and accountability do need to go alongside each other. What effectively happens is that the pressure on education systems and schools and teachers gets transferred downwards onto the pupils. And so we have, at the moment, an epidemic of teenage anxiety around high-stakes assessment and problems with mental health. And at least part of that, I would argue, is because of the high-stakes nature of the entire system and the way in which that accountability is funneled downwards onto the pupils. High stakes. We might also consider that high stakes is an appropriate phrase to use in gambling. And this, to me, introduces perhaps an element of chance or luck. The Finnish education system, education ministers have always said, well, we're not quite sure why we do so well in TIMSS and PISA and PEARLS. We just do what we've always done. And perhaps, actually, it's just luck that Finland happens to be a relatively homogeneous society where everyone agrees about the goals of education and where their education system is geared towards the type of thinking that makes students succeed well in PISA, TIMSS and PEARLS. So we've introduced perhaps an element of randomness or chance into this picture, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. But let's just think a bit more about the societal or political purposes of assessment, high-stakes assessment. These are 16-year-old students, Nepalese students. And one of the features of high-stakes assessment is that it has a funneling or a filtering effect. If they reintroduce grammar schools in England, there will be a funnel or filter at age 11, which prevents the vast majority of pupils from progressing further up the system. In Nepal, they have an exam at age 16 called the School Leaving Certificate, and they take it in 8 subjects. It's actually 80 years old, this exam, hasn't changed very much over those 80 years, and guess who they inherited it from? Yes, it's British originally. It's very much a factual recall type of test. And it's known colloquially in Nepal as the Iron Gate. And the reason why it's known as that is that in order to get any further in the education system, and many of these, particularly the girls here, will aspire to go on to higher education or further education, or to enter certain types of job, and many of the boys, because of the area which they're located in, aspire to join the Gurkhas, and even to learn to drive, you have to pass your school leaving certificate. So it very much is a gate, and it's a filtering mechanism that acts in a way to stratify society. Now, these young people are lucky enough to live here. This is the village of Nangi. It's in the foothills of the Annapurna range. And sometimes it's tough to be an educational researcher. I visited them, and whilst they were doing their school leaving certificate, I actually interviewed the students and their teachers about what they thought about this system. Now, the interesting thing was that for many of the learners, actually they were quite happy with the system. It was a very predictable form of assessment. They knew that if they worked hard and they learnt all the material in the book, then they'd do well. And actually, other societal pressures in Nepal are tending also to keep the school leaving certificate in its current form. For example, private schools in some of the urban centres in Nepal basically operate on a kind of crammer system, and they do much better under the SLC than rural schools like Nangi. And so they've got a vested interest in keeping it like that. But when I interviewed the teachers, they said, well, actually, we don't want to assess pupils in this way. We want pupils to be able to apply the knowledge that we're teaching. We want them to be able to solve problems. We want them to be able to think critically. And the SLC, as it's currently constructed, really limits what we can do as teachers. We just have to prepare them for that recall test. And then when I went to Kathmandu and I interviewed the government officials about the test, they said, well, actually, we'd really like to change the test as well, because it doesn't actually prepare our students very well for international comparisons like PISA, TIMSS and PIRLS, which do require those skills of applying knowledge or thinking critically. But there are factors within Nepalese society which are actually preventing them from undergoing that assessment reform. And I compared that with the situation in England, which at the time GCSEs were being tinkered with by Michael Gove, and we had some very different societal pressures going on in which GCSE exams were moving away from critical thinking and application of knowledge and much more towards recall of facts. So what we've got is these two forms of assessment. On the one hand, we've got assessment for learning, which has as its focus the student and providing appropriate feedback to the student. On the other hand, we've got high-stakes assessment, assessment of learning, which has as its focus reporting on achievement and accountability. And teachers tend to see these as very different forms of assessment. A lot of teachers actually don't make the links between them. And yet, at the heart of both purposes is the same process. It's the gathering of evidence, and it's the making of judgments on achievement on the basis of that evidence. So why could it not be that the process that's going on here in the classroom could actually directly inform the process that's then going on to produce these achievement outcomes? And that would then remove that divide between good assessment and bad assessment, if you like. I think one of the reasons why we have this problem and see assessment in two different ways is because we're caught up in high-stakes assessment within what I might call a measurement paradigm. We apply the processes of physical science to education, which is essentially a social science. We think that if we can measure something sufficiently accurately, then we can provide reliable statistical information to judge the quality of learning and the quality of an education system. You might recognize this picture. It's a phrenology head. And phrenology was a bit of pseudoscience that went on back in the 19th century. And the idea was that by measuring the skull and looking at particular bumps on the skull, you could actually gain an insight into the moral character of a human being. Now, are there any cognitive neuroscientists in the audience? Good. Because okay, there's no real link between phrenology and cognitive neuroscience, which is a respectable science based on a lot of evidence. However, what are we doing in cognitive neuroscience? We are examining the inside of the skull. We're looking by detailed scans of the brain at what happens when humans are asked to do certain tasks. And we're increasingly localizing particular cognitive functions in particular parts of the brain. And maybe the ultimate aim of cognitive neuroscience in terms of educational assessment is that we wouldn't ever have to set students tasks at all. They'd never have to sit an exam. All we do is connect them up to a bunch of electrodes and just measure the learning that's going on in their minds. Be nice, wouldn't it? But I would argue that actually that's misapplying the measurement, the physical science paradigm to what's effectively a social science. And here's where the quantum physics comes in. Because even in physical science, we can't necessarily measure things accurately. So this is Werner Heisenberg, and you've probably heard of his Heisenberg's uncertainty principle and the idea of indeterminacy. And the principle, very simply put, is that if we have a particle, a very tiny fundamental particle, and we want to measure where it is, then in order to be able to see it, we have to shine a photon of light on it, which bounces off, and then we can record that and have a look, see where it is. But the trouble is that by shining the photon of light on it, we actually move it. So the very act of observation changes what we see. And Heisenberg's uncertainty principle says that the product of the uncertainty in the position and the momentum of the particle is always greater than or equal to a certain fundamental constant. You can never know both the position and the momentum at the same time. And in fact, you can visualize or model a particle as a probability wave. And interestingly enough, we've got the old bell curve coming in here. A particle, until you actually try and measure it, can exist in several states at once. It is both here and here simultaneously. It exists as a kind of smudge, a wavy indeterminacy until we actually try and pin down where it is. Now, this idea caused quite a lot of problem for early quantum physicists, and they thought, well, this can't really be true in the macro world as we understand it. And so one of the outcomes of this was that Erwin Schrödinger proposed his famous cat thought experiment. See, I've studied it, I've been there, and I've got the T-shirt. And what he says is, no cats were actually harmed in the making of this experiment. Okay, so imagine you've got a cat in a box, and it sits in a box with a radioactive substance, one atom of a radioactive substance, which, if it decays, it emits a particle which is picked up by this detector, connected electrically to a vial of poison gas, so that if the radioactive substance decays, the gas is released, the cat dies. But actually, according to the principles of quantum mechanics, we can never know whether this single particle of radioactive substance has decayed or not. And in fact, it exists in both states simultaneously as a probability wave, both decayed and undecayed. And so Schrodinger says, well, that's ridiculous, because that means that the cat is both alive and dead. You only know whether the cat is alive or dead when you open the box. Okay, a bit more kind of spurious analogy going on here. So, say the box is a child's mind. Okay, we can look at what comes out, we can look at what goes in, but actually, in order to really find out what's happening in there, we need to open the box. And there's been a famous paper produced by Paul Black a few years ago called Inside the Black Box. And it was one of the seminal papers in, Dylan Williams was the other author, in the development of assessment of learning. You've got to open up the box. You've got to look inside to see how the child is thinking and how you can influence it. And by making the judgment, by making the assessment, you're actually changing what you're assessing. So the principle of indeterminacy is actually already present within the idea of educational assessment. And so even within testing theory, we have the element of error. So classical test theory states that if X is the observed score and T is the true score, hypothetical average score resulting from many repetitions, then there's always going to be an error which is caused by the imprecision of X as being a good test of that potential. And in both item response theory and rash measurement theory, the chance of a student being able to answer a particular question correctly or not is always expressed as a probability and contains within it an element of measurement error. So I think we're arriving at a realization that perhaps educational assessment is not an exact science. Where might these errors come from? Well, here we might introduce a few key criteria for effective assessment. One is validity. So if the assessment instrument isn't measuring what it's claiming to measure, then we might have an error in validity. There's also impact. What impact is the assessment having? If it's creating so much anxiety that the student isn't able to perform to their capacity, then again that's creating a source of error. If the assessment criteria and their application are open to different interpretations, so that one marker might make one judgment and another might make another, then we've got poor reliability. And ultimately, if the assessment process is not manageable, then assessors may start to cut corners, which again will result in error. So, to be an effective assessment, it's got to be valid, have positive impact, reliable, and manageable. But actually, there's always a trade-off between these. If you've got a pencil and paper test, multiple choice, it may be very reliable, but it may not have very high validity in measuring what you're hoping to measure. If you've got an observation made by a teacher in the classroom, it may have high validity, but it may not be very reliable in that other teachers might make a different interpretation, and it also might have problems for manageability in terms of how you record that and factor that into the child's record. So there's always going to be a balance to be achieved between these different features of assessment. What that doesn't prevent is education systems and schools from becoming obsessed with numerical data. Now, I am a secondary school governor, and we are regularly presented with extremely convincing spreadsheets of numerical data on all aspects of the performance of the students in the school. Very impressive. I've also been a parent, and I've been along to many parents' evenings where teachers have brought out their spreadsheets and have said, yes, well, he was a 6B last term, so we predict that his target for next term should be a 6A. Okay, not quite sure what that actually means, but there we are. The trouble is, when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. And it's possible that, whilst I'm a big fan of big data, don't get me wrong, the fact that the data that we're presenting is all based ultimately on human judgments, which may be subject to error, it's possible that we may be basing our education assessment system on somewhat shaky foundations. And we've also got the problem of backwash. Assessment affects teaching. Ultimately, the ultimate example of that is teaching to the test. But any form, particularly if it's high-stakes assessment, will have an influence on the pedagogy that is implemented in the classroom. Good example of this is the abolition of external testing of science in Welsh primary schools in 2006. Age 11. Before the abolition of SATs in science, a lot of Year 6 teachers were spending a lot of their time preparing students for those SATs tests. And Year 6 science was largely revision. Didn't do anything very much new. After the abolition, there were studies done that said that actually teachers got less anxious about the revision and they started doing some more new science and more practical science and fun science and investigative science. Whilst in England, they were still being subject to tests and therefore they were still predominantly revising old work in order to prepare for the tests. In the end, they abolished the science SATs in England in 2010. But unfortunately, an unfortunate backwash effect was that teachers after this time no longer saw science as important as English and maths because they were still being tested. And so although the effect of on pedagogy was positive, actually much less science got taught after the SATs ended than had been while they were still ongoing. So there's all sorts of unintended backwashes that might result from enlightened educational reform. I'm now going to talk a little bit about eScape, which, as Cara said, stands for E-Solutions for Creative Assessment in Portfolio Environments. And one of the purposes of eScape, which is effectively a testing process, was to produce a positive backwash effect. We wanted to create a test in science which students could do, but which would also be relevant pedagogy and would also be an example of good practice in the classroom. And we also wanted to create a test that would have a high degree of validity because we offered students a number of different ways in which they could respond to the assessment questions they were being asked, which is why it's called multimodal. Because using the technology that we had available at the time, we wanted students to be able to express their ideas about science, their capabilities in science, through writing or typing, through drawing, making diagrams, through taking photographs of investigations as they were ongoing, through recording their voice, because we found that many students were much more confident at expressing their scientific ideas verbally or orally than they were when writing them down. Or indeed making videos to show the decisions that they'd taken as part of a scientific inquiry, and maybe even producing a voiceover for the video. So how do we capture all of that multimodal interaction? Well, the idea was that all of this data was actually fed wirelessly onto the teacher's laptop, so that each child had an e-portfolio which was being assembled in real time as they went through the practical activity, and that the teacher could watch on the laptop. They could read the text, they could watch the videos, they could listen to the voices, and it would be captured there long after the lesson had finished. So we started this project back in 2007, and we were looking really at secondary science, and we were looking at an alternative to what was coming into science GCSE exams at the time, which was the idea of the controlled assessment. It was replacing project work, topic work, work that students actually did outside the classroom, often at home. And there was a feeling around that this really wasn't a very reliable form of assessment, and so it was being replaced. Coursework, that's the word I'm thinking of. Coursework was being replaced by controlled assessments. And we wanted a controlled assessment that would also be quite good fun and would be quite an innovative bit of pedagogy. So using the technology of the time, these are PDAs, personal digital assistants, we wrote a test that was broadcast via a wireless network to each student's PDA. This test could run in either strict mode, whereby they'd only get a certain number of minutes for each stage of the test, or in flexible mode, where they had an overall time limit, but they could progress through it at their own pace. And we decided, as a starting point, that we would use a context that was very relevant to the children, that of road safety. And so we posed a real-life scenario to them. You'll become the scientific advisors to the road planners outside this school, trying to improve pedestrian safety. And we started off by keying them into the context, using orientation activities, such as a handling collection. It's quite unusual to use that in science, much more of a design and technology or art and design context. And so the students had to have a look at the collection of road safety related items and had to draw from them what aspects of road safety and perhaps what are the scientific principles on which they were based. We then asked them to create a mind map. And one of the features of eScape is that although students are recording individually on their own PDAs, they can actually contribute to each other's work. And you get a record to say that even though they've been working as a group, you can actually track back who's contributed what. We then, and I'm not going to show you these videos actually because we're running a little bit short of time, but we then introduced a couple of government information videos that were exploring the impact of speed on road safety. So the first one looked at stopping distance, and we got the students to analyse some Department of Transport data and try and model that graphically. We then looked at another video that was looking at the force of impact related to speed, and again got the students to make a prediction in form of a line graph of what they might expect the relationship between speed and force might be. We asked them to plan an investigation. We put out a range of equipment that they could choose from to measure speed using a light gate and a track, to measure force using a Newton meter with telltales, to relate this to mathematical models. This is a few steps on in the task. and then ultimately to make recommendations around traffic calming measures, again based on official data, resulting from the science that they'd explored during the investigation. A little bit later on, we transferred the eScape project to primary. And at the time, 2010, England was considering combining science and technology in the primary curriculum. It didn't actually subsequently do that, though we are now considering that in Wales, interestingly. One of the things that we wanted to do was have a real task that would combine both scientific principles and practical applications. So we had a task about sticky tape. Why do we have different sticky tapes? Comparing and contrasting them. Ranking the tapes in order of stickiness. Thinking about what you could make or repair with a particular type of tape, and planning an investigation to select the appropriate tape. Again, supporting them a little bit with the choice of equipment and the use of spreadsheets to record results, interpretation, and how they might use the results of that investigation to choose the correct sticky tape, and then finally to evaluate and think of ways in which they might have improved the investigation. And all of that results in an e-portfolio. And the way in which we assessed those e-portfolios was quite unusual, because we used a process called adaptive comparative pairs. Now, this chap is Leon Thurston, and he came up with an idea back in 1927 about humans' abilities to make comparisons. And he said, actually, humans are much better at comparing two things than they are at comparing one thing against a scale. And I'm going to illustrate that by asking you to decide how warm it is in this room. Now, I'm not going to ask you to give me a precise numerical figure, but I'm going to give you a 1 to 10 scale, where 1 is the coldest lecture theatre you've ever sat in, and 10 is the warmest lecture theatre you've ever sat in. So how does this room rate on that scale? And as I count up from 1 to 10, I just want you to put your hand up when we get to your number, okay? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, so we've got quite a spread there. And actually, I think if you plotted that, it would come out as roughly a normal distribution, a bell curve. Now I'm going to ask you to make a pairs comparison. I want you to compare the temperature in this lecture theatre with the temperature outside just before you walked in. Hands up if you think it's colder in this lecture theatre than outside, in the open air. Some people just want to sabotage it, don't they? Hands up if you think it's warmer in this lecture theatre than outside in the open air. We have a much higher reliability. Inter-rater reliability is much higher with pairs comparison. And what the adaptive comparative pairs method does is it has an online pairs engine. And you load all of the student portfolios into the pairs engine, and you ask a series of markers to make a series of pairs comparisons. So they're presented with pairs of portfolios, and all they have to say is which one's better. They can, if they like, add reasons, and that then eventually develops criteria for assessment. But initially, they just have to say which one's better. And then the engine presents them with another pair, and it says which one's better. And eventually, iteratively, it starts comparing increasingly similar portfolios. And using a number of different judges, it comes out with a parameter value error plot. Each of these blue dots is a portfolio. We actually had 156 portfolios from 8 schools, and we were asking 8 different teachers to make the judgment. And each of these portfolios is assigned a number between +10 and -10. +10 are the portfolios that win all of their pairs comparisons. -10 are the portfolios that lose all of their pairs comparisons, and the ones in the middle tend to roughly win and lose equal numbers. Now you can see the error bars here, and most of them are pretty acceptable. Up at the top end, we seem to have some difficulty in distinguishing between those very high achievers, and there are 1 or 2 portfolios that stand out as well. But overall, this has a reliability factor of about 0.9, which is as good as SAT's marking. And to turn that into a grading profile, what you have is marker portfolios. So you choose portfolios that just meet a grade boundary, for example. So your A star portfolio might be there, and your AB portfolio might be there, and so you know that all of those are A stars and all of those are A's, for example. And although this sounds quite an unusual method of assessment, it's had actually quite a lot of interest internationally. And we know that authorities in Sweden and Singapore and Brunei have used this in terms of school examinations. We've recently had interest from the Royal Society in the UK at exploring this model a little bit further. And I would argue that actually we do a lot of comparative pairs assessment anyway without realizing it. So, for those of you who are working in a university, you'll all be familiar with the moderation meeting. We've got a piece of work. He says it's a 54, he says it's a 56. How are they arriving at those numbers? Are they really weighting all of the assessment criteria and counting up the numbers to work out exactly where that is? Or are they using their own internal pairs comparison engines? So for this one, it's a bit better than that one that I gave a 53 to, and it's not quite as good as the one I gave a 55 to. Whereas for this lecturer, well, it's actually a bit better than the one I gave a 55 to, but not quite as good as the 57. And so the process of moderation becomes a process of alignment of the pairs engines, not really a process of agreeing on criteria. It's alignment of the pairs engines. And so what we might think is a criterion-referenced assessment system, when you scratch it, it's actually a norm-reference system. So how does this apply to assessment in Wales? So Graham Donaldson, who Cara and I met earlier this evening, is convinced that his new Successful Futures curriculum should be assessed principally by teacher assessment, as Welsh education internally in schools has been since 2006. That's good for reliability, but it's not so good for, good for validity, but not so good for reliability. And he says, well, actually, to make it more reliable, we need to have effective teacher moderation. Well, teachers have been doing moderation in Wales for a number of years, and actually they have cross-phase moderation where primary teachers moderate with secondary teachers. But moderation isn't an entirely straightforward business. It's not a silver bullet. It doesn't just fix that reliability issue. And so some of the research on teacher moderation suggests that actually teachers enjoy it, but it doesn't really make much difference to the judgments that they make, or it takes a very long time to get it right, or if it's high stakes, then there's always going to be a pressure to raise the levels even if you're moderating, which is quite a good reason for having cross-phase moderation, because if they're moderating primary school children, then the primary school teachers are always going to have an upward pressure and the secondary teachers are going to have a downward pressure, so hopefully they meet in the middle. But what Klinowski and Wyatt Smith, who are based in the state of Queensland in Australia, say is actually it's not really enough just to have moderation. What teachers need is assessment literacy. They need to understand how assessment works, what the sources of error are, and particularly what stands and what counts as high-quality assessment. And the state of Queensland does actually have a very rigorous process of external moderation of their teacher assessment, which probably needs to be implemented in Wales. So this is the second research project that Cara referred to, the TAPS project. This is where we tried to create a model of teacher assessment that would enable teachers to develop greater assessment literacy and understand what counts as effective teacher assessment across a whole school. And it was based on this analogy. And this is an analogy between, another scientific analogy, between the flow of energy in an ecosystem and the pyramid of numbers here. And it's saying actually that the flow of information, assessment information in a school, flows from the lower trophic levels, if you like, where the most data is being collected in the classroom, increasingly through a process of data reduction into the higher areas where we've got whole school or class records. And what we tried to do with the 12 schools that work with us on this project is to operationalize that model at a whole school level. So we created our own version of the pyramid with specific criteria for effective assessment in the schools. And if you'll bear with me just a moment, I will just show you the online version of the assessment tool that we created for schools. Okay, so this one looks just the same, it's just that it's online. And what we tried to do through the project is exemplify each of the criteria for effective assessment using examples. So if you click on the online version, it will take you to a series of examples of what that particular aspect of assessment looks like. And then schools could rate themselves as either red, amber, or green on the basis of each of those aspects of assessment. And schools have found this a very useful tool to audit their overall school assessment profile, the use of teacher assessment in the classroom. And we've also provided them with a series of resources in terms of plans for focused assessment tasks in science and work samples that are effectively assessed against those plans. And we ended up with a model of effective teacher assessment. So we've got these two key elements, validity and reliability, which schools need to develop in order to have an effective system of teacher assessment. But it's built upon this plank, this underpinning of a shared understanding of what science is, what counts as science learning, and particularly assessment literacy. In order to be able to balance the validity and reliability of their assessment processes, the schools need to have that underpinning understanding. And the position of that balance, where the balance occurs, is dependent on the manageability of the process. So if schools have a very unmanageable process, it may have high validity, but it's not going to have high reliability because the teachers are not going to be able to implement it. And this year, we're starting a new project, TAPS Cymru, that we're using the models developed through TAPS and the resources with 6 primary schools in Wales, 4 English medium and 2 Welsh medium. We're trying out that self-evaluation tool with them. We're developing some more exemplification of it in a Welsh context. We're developing new tools for use in Welsh schools and new examples related to the Successful Futures curriculum that can be used as assessment tasks. And one of the advantages in Wales is that Wales already has an e-portfolio assessment system, and it's called Inserts. 80% of primary schools use this system, and we know the people at Inserts, called the Assessment Foundation nowadays, and Inserts actually produce an app for your phone, and as a teacher you can select the class and the child and the area of the curriculum, and then you can either take a photo of some piece of work that they're doing and upload it and link it to a curriculum area and a criterion, and you end up with an e-portfolio which can be used to track pupil progress or report to parents. So we're going to be seeing how TAPS works as an overall whole school model of effective teacher assessment with an e-portfolio model. So finally, what might a quantum theory of assessment look like? Here we are, stretching, pulling this analogy until it's broken. Well, I would argue that to have a quantum theory of assessment, it would need to have certain principles lying behind it. It would need to recognize that there is an inherent indeterminacy in educational assessment. It's not an exact science. We cannot measure quantities, student learning precisely. We might like to imagine that all student learning looks like particles that we can count, but actually it's a bit smudgy, like a wave. It would recognize that assessment involves not only measurement, but judgment, human judgment. And humans tend to make errors. They're better at judging comparison between two things than they are at making judgments against a scale. It would recognize that there is a balance to be achieved between different criteria for quality in assessment, particularly reliability and validity, which shifts depending on the purpose of the assessment. Sometimes it looks more reliable, sometimes it looks more valid, and sometimes it's a bit of a duality. And that finally, the act of making an assessment always affects what's being assessed, whether you like it or not. In the positive side, that's feedback which can increase student attainment. And the negative side, it's stress, mental health issues, and students not performing to their capacity. Our job as educators is to ensure that the interventions that we make, the measurements that we take, the black box that we open, always has a positive impact on learners. Because ultimately, we don't want to know whether the cat is alive or dead. We want to know how well it can use a scientific calculator. Thank you.
It's one of the best I've ever seen.
Oh, good. Thank you. Thank you.